The empire that chose to break itself. In 1866, the Austrian Empire lost a war in 7 weeks, and the generals who survived it could not explain why an army that had crushed revolutions across an entire continent had simply collapsed against a smaller enemy. Archaeologists studying Habsburg palace records later found something that shocked them. The royal family had been inbreeding so severely for 3 centuries that some emperors were making decisions with jaws so deformed they could barely speak, and brains that medical historians now believe were genuinely impaired. An empire controlling 50 million people across a dozen languages, built on the most strategic geography in Europe, destroyed not by Napoleon, not by revolution, not by foreign invasion, but by its own blood, its own fear, and one impossible question it refused to answer for 60 years. Can one dynasty rule people who do not want to be ruled? To understand the Austrian Empire, you first need to understand what Europe looked like in the years before it existed, because the Austrian Empire was not built from strength. It was assembled from panic. By 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte had already redrawn the map of Europe more dramatically than any single military commander since Alexander the Great. He had dissolved ancient kingdoms, humiliated centuries-old dynasties, and demonstrated something that European aristocrats had spent generations insisting was impossible: that a man of no royal blood whatsoever could seize the most powerful throne on the continent through sheer military genius and political ruthlessness. For the Habsburg dynasty, the family that had governed Central Europe in various configurations since the 13th century, Napoleon was not simply a military threat. He was an existential argument. His existence proved that the entire ideological foundation of aristocratic rule, the idea that certain families were divinely ordained to govern, was a story, not a fact. And stories, once doubted, are very difficult to restore. The specific institution that Napoleon's rise destroyed was the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling, loosely organized confederation of German-speaking territories that had existed in various forms since 800 CE. The Holy Roman Empire was never as impressive as its name suggested. Voltaire famously observed that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. But it provided the Habsburg dynasty with its primary claim to political legitimacy: the title of Holy Roman Emperor, held by the Habsburgs almost continuously since 1438. When it became clear in 1806 that Napoleon intended to formally dissolve the Holy Roman Empire and replace it with a French-dominated confederation, Franz II faced a choice that would define the next 60 years of European history. He could wait and lose his primary title along with the institutional framework that justified Habsburg authority. Or he could act first, creating a new title that re-anchored Habsburg legitimacy before the old one disappeared. He chose to act. In August 1804, 2 years before the Holy Roman Empire formally ceased to exist, Franz II declared himself Emperor of Austria, Franz I of the new Austrian Empire. It was a political maneuver of considerable cleverness. The new empire had the same territory, the same army, the same administration as before. But it had a new name, a new legal identity, and most importantly, a new claim to sovereignty that did not depend on the crumbling structure Napoleon was about to demolish. What Franz could not solve with a declaration was the fundamental problem that would haunt the Austrian Empire for every year of its existence. The territory he governed contained Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Poles, Croatians, Romanians, Slovaks, Slovenes, and dozens of smaller ethnic communities. All of them increasingly aware, in the age of nationalism, that Napoleon's wars were spreading across Europe, that they had distinct identities, distinct languages, and distinct political interests. The Austrian Empire was born at precisely the historical moment when the idea of multi-ethnic empire was beginning to seem not just unjust, but structurally unstable. Franz I did not have a solution to this problem. He had a response: suppress it. And for a generation, suppression worked. There is a medical mystery at the center of Habsburg history that scientists have been unraveling for over a century, and the answer is more disturbing than most popular histories acknowledge. The Habsburgs practiced strategic marriage as their primary tool of political expansion. The dynasty's motto, Bella gerant Ali, tu felix Austria nube, translates roughly as, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." For 300 years, this strategy worked brilliantly. Marriages connected the Habsburgs to the royal families of Spain, Portugal, France, England, Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia, building an empire through alliance and inheritance that military conquest alone could never have assembled. The consequence was genetic. When families intermarry repeatedly across generations, recessive genetic traits that normally require 2 copies of a defective gene to express, become increasingly likely to appear. In the Habsburg family, the most visible result was what medical historians now call the Habsburg jaw, a pronounced underbite and enlarged lower jaw caused by mandibular prognathism, a condition that became progressively more severe across generations of Habsburg rulers. In 2019, a research team at the University of Santiago de Compostela published a study in the Annals of Human Biology, analyzing portraits of Habsburg rulers across 10 generations. Their conclusion was precise. The degree of facial deformity correlated directly with the degree of inbreeding. Charles II of Spain, the last Spanish Habsburg who died in 1700, had a jaw so deformed that his 2 rows of teeth did not meet, making it physically impossible for him to chew solid food. His tongue was described by contemporaries as so large that he was barely intelligible when he spoke. He was also infertile, mentally impaired by most historical assessments, and suffered from multiple organ conditions that left him in near constant pain throughout his short life. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient, a mathematical measure of genetic relatedness, was calculated by the 2019 study as 0.254. For comparison, the child of a brother and sister has an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Charles II was, genetically, almost equivalent to the child of siblings, despite being the product of generations of cousin marriages rather than direct incest. The Austrian Habsburgs of the 19th century were not as severely inbred as their Spanish cousins, but the pattern continued. Emperor Ferdinand I, who ruled Austria from 1835 to 1848, suffered from epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and cognitive impairment serious enough that his own advisors regularly bypassed him on important decisions. His diary entries, preserved in the Austrian State Archives in Vienna, record his daily life with a childlike simplicity that historians find both poignant and alarming. He was reportedly unable to understand complex political documents and was known for a single famous utterance when told he could not eat apricot dumplings because they were out of season. "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." The tragedy of the Habsburg genetic situation was not simply personal. An emperor who cannot fully process complex political information, who cannot speak clearly, who suffers from chronic pain and neurological impairment, That emperor becomes dependent on advisors, and advisors have their own interests. The gap between the nominal ruler and the actual decision-makers created precisely the kind of political opacity that allowed figures like Metternich to accumulate extraordinary personal power while technically serving a monarch who was theoretically absolute. Vienna in the early 19th century was, by almost any measure, one of the most extraordinary cities on earth, and its position on the map of Europe was the single most important geographic fact in continental politics for nearly a century. Stand on a map of Europe and find the point where the Alps end and the Great Plains of Central Europe begin. The Alps run roughly east to west across southern Europe, forming a natural barrier between the Mediterranean world and the northern European plain. At the eastern end of this barrier, the mountains drop sharply, and the Danube River, flowing from its headwaters in the Black Forest of Germany eastward toward the Black Sea, passes through the gap. Vienna sits directly at this transition point, on the southern bank of the Danube, at the precise location where the mountains give way to open country. This position gave Vienna a combination of strategic advantages that no other city in Central Europe possessed. The Alps to the south and west provided natural defensive protection. Any army attempting to approach Vienna from Italy or Germany faced mountain crossings that slowed movement, exhausted troops, and created natural defensive choke points that small forces could hold against much larger ones. The Danube to the north was a defensive barrier and simultaneously a highway. The river's flow connected Vienna to the agricultural wealth of Hungary to the east and to the German territories to the west, making it the natural hub of any trade network spanning Central Europe. The Viennese also understood their city's cultural strategic value. Under the Habsburgs, Vienna became the musical capital of Europe in a way that was not accidental. The Habsburg court was the most generous patron of classical music in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert all worked in Vienna or in direct connection with Habsburg patronage. This was not simply cultural preference. Music, art, and architecture were political instruments. They projected the image of a civilized, sophisticated, divinely favored dynasty to audiences across Europe who might otherwise see the Habsburgs primarily as military and political operators. The Ringstrasse, the grand boulevard that circles Vienna's historic center, was not built until the second half of the 19th century, but the imperial architecture it eventually showcased reflected a centuries-old Habsburg strategy of using built environment as political communication. The Hofburg Palace, the Belvedere, the Schönbrunn, these were not simply residences. They were arguments, written in stone and gold leaf, about the permanence and legitimacy of Habsburg rule. The Danube trade network that Vienna controlled was genuinely the economic backbone of Central Europe. Grain from Hungary, timber from Bohemia, wine from the Danube Valley, livestock from the Hungarian plain, all of it moved through or past Vienna, generating tariff revenue and commercial activity that funded the imperial court, the army, and the administrative apparatus. The city that sat at the crossroads of Europe's richest river trade network did not need to produce much itself. It needed only to remain the point through which everything else passed. By the early 19th century, Vienna's population had grown to approximately 300,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Europe, behind only London and Paris. Its streets mixed the languages of the empire in a daily urban polyglot. German merchants, Hungarian cavalry officers, Czech craftsmen, Italian musicians, Polish diplomats, and Jewish intellectuals who had found in Vienna a city more tolerant of their presence than most of the continent. This cosmopolitan energy was genuine and productive, and it was also, from the perspective of Habsburg political stability, dangerously unpredictable. The Austrian Empire governed approximately 50 million people, speaking at least 11 distinct languages across a territory that included what is today Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Croatia, Slovenia, parts of Poland, parts of Romania, and the northern regions of Italy. No empire in history had attempted to administer this level of ethnic and linguistic diversity through a single centralized bureaucracy. The Habsburg solution was not elegant, but for several decades it worked. The administrative system France I built after 1804 was designed around a single principle. Information flows upward and authority flows downward, and nothing happens without permission from Vienna. Provincial governors were appointed from Vienna, not elected locally. Local languages were tolerated for everyday use, but German was the language of administration, law, and military command, which meant that advancement in any formal institution required German literacy, and German literacy required access to education controlled by the imperial government. Taxation was standardized across provinces, with rates set centrally and collected by imperial officials who answered to Vienna, not to local authorities. The system produced a bureaucracy of remarkable size and reach. By the mid-19th century, the Austrian imperial civil service employed hundreds of thousands of officials across the empire's territory. These officials formed a distinct social class: educated, German-speaking, loyal to the dynasty rather than to any particular ethnic community, and deeply invested in the continuation of the system that employed them. Franz Kafka, writing in Prague in the early 20th century about the experience of confronting impenetrable bureaucratic systems that appear to operate by rules nobody can fully explain, was drawing directly on his experience with the lingering institutional culture of Habsburg administration. The taxation system was particularly significant because it revealed the empire's internal contradictions. Hungarian nobles had successfully negotiated exemptions from direct imperial taxation that dated back centuries. This meant that the tax burden fell disproportionately on the empire's least powerful subjects: the peasants of Bohemia, the craftsmen of Vienna, the urban workers of the Italian provinces. The nobility of Hungary contributed almost nothing to the imperial treasury, while consuming enormous imperial military resources in the constant border maintenance required to keep the Ottoman Empire at a safe distance. Military governance was the empire's most direct tool of control. The Austrian army maintained permanent garrisons in every major provincial city, and the regular deployment of troops to suppress local disturbances was so routine that it barely registered in official communications. The word used in Austrian administrative documents for these operations was pacification, a term that covered everything from dispersing a crowd of protesting university students to suppressing a full-scale armed uprising. The distinction between police work and military operation was blurry by design. What the iron grip could not suppress was thought. Ideas travel faster than troops, and the ideas spreading across Europe in the first half of the 19th century, nationalism, liberalism, constitutional government, the rights of peoples to self-determination, were precisely the ideas most dangerous to a dynasty whose legitimacy rested on the claim that the same family had the right to govern Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, and Austrians simultaneously, regardless of what any of those peoples wanted. The Austrian Imperial Army was one of the most visually distinctive military forces in European history, and its appearance told a story about the empire's self-understanding that was more accurate than any official proclamation. Austrian infantry wore white coats, a color that military historians find genuinely puzzling from a practical standpoint, since white uniforms are visible at long distances, difficult to keep clean on campaign, and psychologically associated with surrender in European military culture. The explanation most historians accept is that the white uniform was inherited from the earlier Habsburg military tradition and maintained through institutional inertia long after its practical disadvantages had become obvious. An army that chose visibility over camouflage was making a statement. We are not hiding, we are here, and you should fear us. The cavalry was the most celebrated arm of the Austrian military, and the one in which Habsburg investment was most consistently maintained. The Lipizzaner horses, white stallions bred at the imperial stud farm at Lipica in modern Slovenia, became symbols of Austrian imperial culture that outlasted the empire itself. The Spanish riding school in Vienna, which trained both horses and riders in classical dressage, was not simply an entertainment venue. It was a demonstration of the Austrian military's mastery of the most expensive and elite form of warfare available in the pre-industrial era. The artillery was more advanced. Austrian engineers had developed sophisticated cannon designs by the early 19th century, and Austrian fortress engineering, the science of designing defensive positions, was considered among the best in Europe. The fortified city of Königgrätz, whose defences the Austrians had spent years improving, was considered essentially impregnable by most military analysts before 1866. The Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805 was the most significant military catastrophe in the Austrian Empire's early history, and its lessons were imperfectly absorbed. Napoleon's French army, outnumbered by the combined Austrian and Russian forces, executed one of the most brilliant tactical maneuvers in military history. Feigning weakness on his right flank to draw the Allied forces off the high ground, then striking the weakened centre with devastating speed. The Austrian and Russian casualties were approximately 36,000 men. Napoleon lost fewer than 9,000. The battle demonstrated that the Austrian military's tactical doctrine, which relied on holding prepared positions and maintaining careful formations, was dangerously vulnerable to an enemy willing to move faster and accept greater risk. The reforms that followed Austerlitz were genuine but incomplete. The Austrian military improved its logistics, restructured its command hierarchy, and attempted to incorporate some of the tactical flexibility that Napoleon's armies had demonstrated. But a fundamental tension remained unresolved. An army that served an empire of many nations needed to be able to communicate across language barriers, maintain loyalty from soldiers who might be fighting alongside men who spoke 4 different languages, and sustain morale in units where officers and enlisted men shared neither language nor cultural background. The Austrian solution, a strict hierarchy in which German-speaking officers commanded multilingual enlisted units using standardized drill procedures that minimized the need for complex verbal communication, worked adequately in defense and failed repeatedly in offensive operations that required initiative and improvisation at lower command levels. Clemens von Metternich was not an emperor. He held no royal title and no hereditary authority. But from approximately 1809 to 1848, he was the most powerful man in Europe. Not because he commanded armies, but because he understood something about power that most rulers of his era did not. That the most durable form of control is not force, but the prevention of alternatives. Metternich served as Austrian foreign minister and later state chancellor under 3 emperors, Franz I, Ferdinand I, and the young Franz Joseph I. His formal role was diplomacy. His actual function was the management of European political reality in a way that preserved Habsburg power and, more broadly, the aristocratic order that all of Europe's established dynasties depended on. He was brilliant, methodical, and completely without illusions about human nature. He believed that most people, given freedom, would make choices that destabilized the social order. Not out of wickedness, but out of short-sightedness. The role of statesman was to prevent freedom from producing chaos. His primary domestic tool was the secret police. The Austrian imperial secret police under Metternich was not a casual surveillance operation. It was a systematic, bureaucratically organized intelligence apparatus that opened mail, paid informants in universities and coffeehouses, monitored the publications of foreign newspapers entering Austrian territory, and maintained files on thousands of individuals considered potentially subversive. The files were stored in the State Chancellery in Vienna, the building that housed Metternich's own offices, and reviewed regularly by Metternich himself. The targets were not primarily foreign agents. They were Austrian and Central European intellectuals, students, journalists, and political theorists whose ideas, if spread widely, could undermine Habsburg legitimacy. The German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, writing in Berlin, was read in Vienna, and his ideas about the historical development of freedom and the eventual supersession of existing political forms were exactly the kind of thinking Metternich's system was designed to quarantine from public discussion. Writers and journalists who published material the censorship office found objectionable were subject to confiscation of their work, prohibition from publishing, and in serious cases, arrest and imprisonment. The Austrian playwright Franz Grillparzer, one of the most important literary figures of the period, had multiple works suppressed or delayed by imperial censorship. The composer Franz Schubert, living in Vienna during this period, set some of his most politically suggestive poems to music in private gatherings called Schubertiades, small, intimate concerts held in private homes, partly because public performance of certain material was too risky. The system Metternich built was effective at preventing organized political opposition. It was entirely ineffective at preventing the spread of ideas. By the 1840s, nationalist movements were organizing across the empire's territory, in Hungary, in Italy, in Bohemia, in the German provinces. And the secret police files that had grown to enormous size documented not the suppression of nationalism, but its unstoppable spread. In March 1848, when revolutionary uprisings began simultaneously in Vienna, Budapest, Prague, and Milan, Metternich was caught almost entirely by surprise. Within days, he had resigned, fled Vienna disguised as a common traveller, and gone into exile in London. The system he had built over nearly 40 years collapsed in a week. For the vast majority of the 50 million people who lived within the Austrian Empire's borders, the reality of imperial rule was experienced not through diplomacy or military campaigns, but through the everyday textures of work, taxation, housing, disease, and the slow grind of a social system that assigned your life's possibilities largely at the moment of your birth. The empire's agricultural foundation was the serf system of Hungary and Bohemia, a structure that, while formerly more limited than Russian serfdom, still tied peasant families to the land and to obligations of labor and payment to noble landowners that consumed a significant portion of their productive capacity. In Hungary, where the nobility had successfully maintained their exemption from imperial taxation, the burden of supporting both the local noble class and the imperial administration fell entirely on the peasantry. A Hungarian peasant family in the early 19th century might owe their landlord 3 days of labor per week, the robot, as this obligatory work was called, plus payments in kind from their harvest, plus whatever taxes the imperial administration managed to collect. What remained for their own subsistence was, in poor harvest years, barely adequate. The cholera epidemics that swept through Vienna in 1831 and 1832, and again in 1848, revealed the gap between the city's imperial splendor and its underlying sanitary reality with brutal clarity. Vienna's population had grown rapidly in the early 19th century as workers migrated from the empire's rural provinces to find employment in the city's expanding manufacturing sector. Housing had not kept pace. Working-class neighborhoods were densely packed, poorly ventilated, and entirely dependent on shared water sources that were regularly contaminated by runoff from the city's inadequate waste disposal systems. The 1831 epidemic killed approximately 2,000 people in Vienna alone. The 1848 epidemic, arriving simultaneously with revolutionary political upheaval, created a crisis of public confidence in imperial governance that contributed directly to the political explosion of that year. The construction of Austria's first railway lines in the 1830s and 1840s was the most significant change in ordinary life for the empire's working population since the Napoleonic Wars. The first steam-powered railway line in the Austrian Empire opened in 1837, connecting Vienna to the town of Deutsch-Wagram. By 1848, approximately 1,500 kilometers of track had been laid across the empire's territory. For workers, the railways meant the possibility of migration, moving from a depressed agricultural region to a city with manufacturing employment. For merchants, they meant dramatically reduced transport costs and access to markets previously reachable only by slow, expensive road transport. For the imperial military, they meant the ability to move troops across the empire's territory at speeds that completely transformed strategic planning. The daily reality of life under Habsburg rule for most of the empire's non-German-speaking populations was one of systematic disadvantage in every formal institution. Education above the primary level was conducted in German. Legal proceedings in the imperial courts were conducted in German. Military advancement required German language competence. A Hungarian nobleman or a Czech merchant who wanted to participate fully in the empire's political and economic life needed to become functionally bilingual, and the second language had to be German, because no German official was required to learn Hungarian or Czech in return. The Austrian Empire was, architecturally and culturally, one of the most productive civilizations of the 19th century, and this productivity existed in constant, uncomfortable tension with the political repression that the empire's rulers considered necessary for its survival. Vienna's Baroque architectural heritage, the legacy of the 17th and 18th century building campaigns funded by Habsburg wealth, gave the city a physical grandeur that impressed virtually every visitor. The Schönbrunn Palace, built in its current form beginning in 1696 and expanded through the 18th century, contains 1,441 rooms and is set in formal gardens extending across approximately 160 hectares. The Belvedere complex, built for the military commander Prince Eugene of Savoy in the early 18th century, comprises two palaces connected by formal gardens that became the model for palace garden design across Central Europe. These buildings were not simply residences. They were instruments of diplomatic communication. Foreign ambassadors received in these spaces understood immediately that they were dealing with a dynasty of extraordinary resources and refined taste. The Imperial Library, the Österreichische Nationalbibliothek, housed in its Baroque hall one of the largest collections of manuscripts and printed books in Europe, with holdings that included ancient papyri from Egypt, manuscripts from the Byzantine Empire, and the accumulated documentary record of centuries of Habsburg administration. The hall itself, designed by Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach and completed in 1726, is one of the most beautiful interior spaces in Europe. A vast oval room lined with carved wooden bookshelves rising to ceiling frescoes depicting the apotheosis of Emperor Charles VI. The message was unmistakable. Habsburg rule and human knowledge were intertwined, and the dynasty that housed this collection was the guardian of civilization itself. Prague, the capital of Bohemia and the empire's second most important city, preserved one of the most complete medieval urban cores in Europe, largely because the city had been spared the large-scale reconstruction that transformed other major European cities in the 19th century. The Charles Bridge, the Old Town Square with its astronomical clock, the Jewish quarter with its synagogues dating to the 13th century, these were the physical inheritance of a city that had been, in the 16th and early 17th centuries, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire under Rudolf II, and one of the great centers of European art and science. Budapest, or more precisely, the two cities of Buda on the western bank of the Danube and Pest on the eastern bank, which were not formally unified until 1873, was the focal point of Hungarian national identity and the most politically sensitive major city in the empire. Hungarian nobles maintained their ancient parliament, their distinct legal traditions, and their cultural pride in a language and history entirely separate from the German-Austrian mainstream. The tension between Budapest's aspirations and Vienna's control was the central political fault line of the entire empire, and every major political crisis of the period ran along it. The Austrian Empire was, constitutionally and culturally, a Catholic state, and Catholicism was not merely the personal faith of the Habsburg dynasty, but an integral component of the political system through which the empire governed its diverse population. The relationship between the Habsburg dynasty and the Catholic Church was one of mutual dependency stretching back to the 13th century. The Habsburgs needed the Church's institutional network, its parish system, its educational infrastructure, its moral authority, to govern territories too large and diverse for purely secular administration. The Church needed Habsburg military protection and financial support to maintain its position against Protestant competition in the German lands and against Orthodox Christianity in the empire's eastern territories. The result was an alliance in which religious and political authority were so thoroughly intertwined that it was often difficult to distinguish where one ended and the other began. Parish priests throughout the empire served simultaneously as religious leaders and as the lowest level of the imperial information-gathering system. They maintained records of births, deaths, and marriages, the vital statistics without which taxation, military conscription, and property law could not function. They reported unusual activities or subversive statements to their bishops, who reported to the ecclesiastical hierarchy, which maintained close communication with the imperial government. The confessional, the private conversation between priest and penitent that Catholic theology required, was not formally a source of state intelligence. But in practice, the close relationship between church and state meant that the boundary was blurry. The Habsburg dynasty's self-presentation as defenders of Catholicism against its enemies, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, Muslims, and later liberals and socialists, was not simply propaganda. It was a genuine component of dynastic identity that shaped decision-making at the highest levels. The memory of the 30 Years' War, in which Habsburg forces had fought to defend Catholic power in the German lands against Protestant challengers, was kept alive in official ceremonial, in the religious orders that the dynasty patronized, and in the architectural language of the empire's churches, which were deliberately built to project Catholic triumphalism in territories where the religious settlement remained contested. The religious festivals and ceremonies that punctuated the Habsburg calendar served the same function that Roman circuses had served in the ancient world. They provided public spectacle that reinforced hierarchy, demonstrated imperial generosity, and occupied the emotional and ritual needs of the population in forms that the state could monitor and control. The great imperial funeral ceremonies, the Habsburg burial ritual in the Kaisergruft, the imperial crypt beneath the Kapuzinerkirche in Vienna, where Habsburg rulers were entombed in elaborate copper sarcophagi with extraordinary ceremony, were political theatre as much as religious observance, reminding Vienna's population that the dynasty they served was connected to a continuity of power stretching back centuries and forward into an indefinite future. The limits of religious control became apparent as the 19th century progressed. Jewish intellectuals in Vienna, who had gained increasing legal rights through gradual emancipation policies, were producing some of the most important philosophical, scientific, and artistic work of the era, drawing on traditions entirely outside the Catholic framework. Protestant communities in the empire's northern territories maintained their distinct religious identities despite official pressure. And the growing secular liberal movement, which drew on Enlightenment philosophy rather than religious tradition, represented a challenge that neither Habsburg political authority nor Catholic moral authority had adequate tools to answer. The Austrian Empire's relationship with technological and scientific progress was one of the defining contradictions of its existence. A state governed by men who were ideologically committed to the preservation of existing hierarchies, confronting a century of innovations that systematically undermined every hierarchy that existed. The railway was the most politically significant technology of the 19th century, and the Austrian Empire's engagement with it illustrates the contradiction precisely. The first Austrian railway, horse-drawn, opened in 1832 between Linz and Budweis, was built by a private entrepreneur, Franz Anton von Gerstner, who had studied railway technology in England and recognized its economic potential for connecting the Danube Valley to the Bohemian grain-producing region. The imperial government's initial response was cautious. Railways required large land acquisitions, disrupted existing transport businesses, and, most significantly from a security standpoint, could move large numbers of people rapidly across territory in ways that were difficult to monitor or control. By the late 1830s, the military argument for railways had become overwhelming. The 1848 revolutions, in which the imperial government needed to move troops rapidly from one part of the empire to another to suppress multiple simultaneous uprisings, demonstrated definitively that railway capacity was a military necessity. The imperial government moved from cautious observer to active promoter of railway construction, but in a characteristically Habsburg fashion, through state ownership and control rather than private enterprise, with routes chosen for military strategic value rather than purely economic efficiency. The steam engine's penetration into Austrian manufacturing was slower and more uneven than in Britain or the German states. The empire's textile industries in Bohemia adopted steam power in the 1830s and 1840s, creating factory systems that displaced cottage textile workers and generated the urban industrial working class that would become the social base of later socialist movements. But the Hungarian agricultural economy, politically controlled by a nobility ideologically hostile to industrialization, remained largely unmechanized through the middle of the century. The empire's scientific contributions were genuine and substantial. The astronomer Christian Doppler, working at the Prague Polytechnic Institute in the 1840s, described the phenomenon of frequency shift in moving wave sources that now bears his name, the Doppler effect. The physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, working in Vienna in the second half of the 19th century, developed the statistical mechanical foundations of thermodynamics that remain essential to modern physics. Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian friar working in Brno in Moravia in the 1860s, conducted the pea plant experiments that established the basic principles of genetic inheritance, work that was ignored during his lifetime and rediscovered in 1900 to become the foundation of modern genetics. What the empire could not resolve was the tension between the educational system that produced these scientists and the political system that employed their results selectively. Technical education in the empire's polytechnic institutes was excellent. Political education, the capacity to think critically about social organization and governance, was systematically suppressed. The result was a culture that produced remarkable natural scientists and engineers, while remaining politically paralyzed, generating the knowledge needed for modernization, while refusing the political reforms that modernization required. The Austrian Empire's most dangerous enemies were never the foreign armies it fought. They were the ideas that spread through its own universities, coffee houses, and printing houses. Ideas that, once understood by enough people, made the empire's continued existence impossible to justify. The concept of nationalism, the idea that peoples sharing a common language, culture, and historical memory constitute a natural political unit with the right to self-governance, was the intellectual solvent that dissolved the Austrian Empire's legitimacy from within. In a state governing Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Italians, Romanians, Croatians, Slovenes, and Slovaks under German-speaking Habsburg authority, nationalism was not merely a political philosophy. It was a direct argument that the empire had no right to exist in its current form. Hungarian nationalism was the most politically developed and therefore the most immediately threatening. Hungary had its own parliament, its own legal traditions, and its own language, Magyar, which is linguistically unrelated to any other European language, and therefore impossible to confuse with German or any Slavic tongue. Hungarian nobles who had studied in German universities came home with Enlightenment ideas about constitutional government and national self-determination, filtered through a specifically Hungarian historical consciousness of ancient constitutional rights dating back to the Golden Bull of 1222. By the 1840s, the Hungarian reformer István Széchenyi and the revolutionary nationalist Lajos Kossuth were leading competing but reinforcing movements for Hungarian autonomy that the imperial government in Vienna had no political mechanism to accommodate, short of granting Hungary effective independence. Italian nationalism presented a different kind of challenge. The empire's Italian provinces, Lombardy and Venetia in the north of the peninsula, were among its wealthiest territories, contributing disproportionately to imperial tax revenues and hosting some of the empire's most productive manufacturing and commercial activity. They were also the territories most connected, geographically and culturally, to the broader Italian nationalist movement that dreamed of unifying the peninsula's fragmented states into a single Italian nation. The revolutionary movements of 1848 produced uprisings in Milan and Venice that Austrian troops suppressed with considerable brutality. The military commander Joseph Radetzky von Radetz, who restored Austrian control over Lombardy, was celebrated in Vienna with a famous march by Johann Strauss. Senior in Italy, his name became synonymous with foreign occupation. The competition with Prussia was a structural problem that no amount of internal management could resolve. Prussia, the most dynamic and militarily aggressive of the German states, had a fundamentally incompatible vision of German political organization from Austria's. Austria wanted a German confederation in which Habsburg authority provided the organizing framework. Prussia wanted German unification under Prussian leadership, which necessarily meant displacing Habsburg influence from German affairs. The contest between these two visions was the central drama of German politics from the 1840s through 1866, and it ended with a clarity that no Austrian strategist wanted to accept. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815 was Metternich's greatest achievement, and the clearest demonstration of what Austrian imperial diplomacy could accomplish when operating from a position of strength. After Napoleon's defeat, the major European powers gathered in Vienna to redraw the continent's political map, and Metternich served as the host, chief architect, and primary beneficiary of the settlement they produced. The outcome suited Austrian interests almost perfectly. The German Confederation that replaced the defunct Holy Roman Empire gave Austria the presidency, formal leadership of the German political world without the administrative burden of direct governance. The Italian peninsula was divided into states, most of which were governed by Habsburg relatives or bound to Austria by alliance, effectively making the entire peninsula an Austrian sphere of influence. The broader European settlement established the Concert of Europe, a system of periodic great power consultation that was designed to resolve disputes before they escalated to war, and that functioned, with varying effectiveness, for the next century. At its peak in the decades following the Congress of Vienna, the Austrian Empire controlled territory stretching from the foothills of the Alps in the west to the Carpathian Mountains in the east, from the Danube Plain in the north to the Adriatic coast in the south. Its population of approximately 35 million people in 1820 made it one of the most populous states in Europe. Its army of approximately 300,000 men was one of the largest standing forces on the continent. Its economy, while less industrialized than Britain's, was diversified across manufacturing, agriculture, and commerce in ways that made it genuinely resilient. The imperial court in Vienna set standards of cultural consumption that echoed across the continent. The Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, founded in 1842, became the benchmark against which other European orchestras measured themselves. Viennese fashion, Viennese cuisine, Viennese coffee houses. The city's cultural output was absorbed and imitated from Paris to St. Petersburg. The concept of Gemütlichkeit, a specifically Viennese form of comfortable, warm sociability, centered on shared food, music, and conversation, became an export product almost as valuable as the empire's actual manufactured goods. What the peak obscured was the acceleration of exactly the processes that would eventually destroy the empire. The same economic development that was generating the prosperity of the 1820s and 1830s was creating an urban working class with interests incompatible with the existing social order. The same educational system that was producing the scientists and administrators the empire needed was spreading liberal and nationalist ideas among the students it trained. The same trade networks that were enriching Vienna's merchants were strengthening the economic case for Hungarian and Bohemian autonomy by demonstrating that these regions could prosper independently of Habsburg central management. The year 1848 is the pivot point of the Austrian Empire's history, the moment when the suppressed contradictions of the previous 40 years erupted simultaneously across the entire empire and demonstrated, with a clarity that could not be ignored, that the existing political structure was no longer sustainable. The immediate trigger was external: the February Revolution in Paris that overthrew the French monarchy and sent shockwaves of political excitement across Europe's educated classes. But the conditions that made the Austrian Empire so vulnerable to those shockwaves had been building for decades. By 1848, the empire's urban populations were suffering from several years of poor harvests that had driven grain prices to levels that consumed most of a working family's income. Industrial workers in Vienna and Prague were experiencing the early dislocations of factory manufacturing. irregular employment, low wages, dangerous working conditions, without any of the social safety nets that later industrial societies would develop. University students had spent years absorbing liberal and nationalist ideas, while watching the political system refuse any accommodation with reform. The revolution that erupted in Vienna in March 1848 forced Metternich's resignation within days, and terrified Emperor Ferdinand I so thoroughly that he eventually fled the capital entirely, retreating to Innsbruck and then to Olmütz. The revolutionary government that briefly controlled Vienna demanded a constitution, freedom of the press, and the abolition of the censorship system that had defined Austrian political life for a generation. In Budapest, Lajos Kossuth's government declared Hungarian autonomy and began acting as an independent state. In Prague, Czech nationalists convened a Slavic Congress. In Milan and Venice, Italian nationalists expelled Austrian forces and declared republics. The empire's survival in 1848 came down to three factors: the loyalty of the Croatian military under Ban Josip Jelačić, who marched against the Hungarian revolutionary government rather than joining it; the discipline of Field Marshal Radetsky's army in Italy, which suppressed the Italian uprisings with sustained military force; and the decision of Franz Joseph I, the 18-year-old nephew who replaced the incapacitated Ferdinand in December 1848, to accept Russian military assistance in crushing the Hungarian Revolution in 1849. The Russian intervention was the most consequential decision of the entire crisis, and not in the way the Habsburgs intended. Russian forces under General Paskevich crushed the Hungarian Revolutionary Army by August 1849. Austria had been saved, but at the cost of a dependency on Russian goodwill that would constrain Austrian foreign policy for the next decade, and at the cost of a Hungarian national humiliation so deep that it would never be forgiven. Franz Joseph's response to the failed revolution was not reform, but intensification. The constitution that the revolutionary period had briefly produced was suspended. German centralization was accelerated. A new concordat with the Catholic Church in 1855 gave the Church increased control over education and family law in exchange for political support. The military budget was expanded. The result was a system that was, if anything, more rigid than what had existed before 1848, and therefore even more brittle when the next crisis came. The 7 Weeks' War of 1866, known in German as the Deutschen Krieg, the German War, lasted from June 14th to July 26th. In that time, Prussia demonstrated that the Austrian Empire's military, administrative, and political systems had fallen so far behind the pace of 19th-century modernization that the empire could no longer defend its own position in the international order it had helped create. The Prussian army that defeated Austria in 1866 was a fundamentally different military instrument from any force Austria had previously faced. The Dries needle gun, the Prussian infantry's standard weapon, could be loaded and fired lying down at a rate of approximately 5 rounds per minute. The Austrian Lorenz rifle required soldiers to stand upright to reload and fired approximately 1 round per minute. In a battle between forces of equal size and training, this differential in firepower was decisive before any question of tactics or leadership arose. The Battle of Königgrätz on July 3, 1866, also known as the Battle of Sadowa, was the largest battle in European history to that point, involving approximately 440,000 soldiers on both sides. The Austrian army held its prepared defensive positions with considerable courage against the initial Prussian attacks. Then, the Prussian Second Army arrived on the Austrian flank, having marched through terrain the Austrians had considered impassable. The Austrian position collapsed. Casualties on the Austrian side reached approximately 44,000 killed, wounded, and captured. Prussia lost approximately 9,000. The political consequences arrived almost immediately. Austria was expelled from the German Confederation, the organization its emperors had led for 60 years. The Italian province of Venetia, which Austria had retained despite losing Lombardy in 1859, was ceded to the new Kingdom of Italy. The Prussian-dominated North German Confederation that replaced the German Confederation explicitly excluded Austrian participation. In 4 years, the diplomatic structure that Metternich had spent his career constructing had been dismantled entirely. The Hungarian response to Austria's humiliation was immediate and precise. Hungarian political leaders, particularly Ferenc Deák, the moderate nationalist who had been waiting for exactly this moment, made clear to Vienna that Hungary would not continue under the existing arrangement. The choice was simple: negotiate a genuine power-sharing agreement or face Hungarian rebellion at a moment when Austria had no military capacity to suppress it. The Ausgleich, the compromise, of 1867 was the Austrian Empire's attempt to survive by transforming itself. Under its terms, the empire was reorganized as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a dual monarchy in which Austria and Hungary were separate states sharing only the monarch, the army, and the foreign ministry. Hungary received its own parliament, its own government, its own courts, and effective control over its internal affairs. The German centralization that had been imposed since 1849 was reversed. The empire that Franz I had created in 1804 effectively ceased to exist in 1867. What replaced it, the dual monarchy, was a compromise that satisfied neither side fully, gave the empire's other nationalities nothing, and created a constitutional structure so complex that it generated continuous, low-level political crisis for the remaining 50 years of its existence, until the First World War destroyed it entirely. The Austrian Empire disappeared from the map in 1918, dissolved in the aftermath of the First World War into a collection of successor states whose borders were drawn by exhausted diplomats at the Paris Peace Conference, with only partial attention to the ethnic realities on the ground. And yet, the empire's legacy, in law, in culture, in urban design, in scientific achievement, and in the unresolved political questions it left behind, has shaped European history continuously from that moment to the present. The Habsburg legal tradition produced a framework of administrative law, the rules governing the relationship between citizens and the state, that survived the empire's collapse and formed the foundation of legal systems across Central Europe. Austrian administrative law, codified through the 19th century, established principles of procedural fairness, rights of appeal, and bureaucratic accountability that were genuinely advanced by the standards of their era. The Austrian Administrative Court, established in 1875, was one of the first institutions in Europe specifically designed to review government decisions for legality, a concept that underlies modern administrative law in Germany, Austria, the Czech Republic, and their neighbors. The cultural legacy is even more visible. Vienna in the final decades of the empire produced a concentration of artistic and intellectual achievement that has few parallels in European history. Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis in Vienna. Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele transformed the visual arts. Arnold Schoenberg revolutionized music. Ludwig Wittgenstein reshaped philosophy. Karl Popper laid the foundations of the philosophy of science. Stefan Zweig, Arthur Schnitzler, and Robert Musil produced literary work that remains among the most important in the German language. The Viennese coffeehouse culture, the institution that had provided the social infrastructure for intellectual exchange throughout the imperial period, generated this output in a specific urban environment that historians continue to study as a model of productive cultural ecology. Recent archaeological and historical research has added new dimensions to the understanding of Habsburg administration that were not visible to earlier generations of scholars. Digital analysis of the vast Habsburg administrative archives, which survive in remarkable completeness in the Austrian state archives in Vienna and in archives across the successor states, has allowed historians to map the flow of information, money, and personnel through the imperial system with a precision previously impossible. These studies have revealed that the empire was considerably more administratively sophisticated than its popular image as a sclerotic, tradition-bound bureaucracy suggests, and also that the gap between the quality of its administrative information and the quality of its political decision-making was the central dysfunction of the system. The empire often knew exactly what was wrong. It repeatedly chose not to act on that knowledge. The historical question that the Austrian Empire most urgently raises is one that remains deeply relevant. The empire governed enormous ethnic and cultural diversity through a combination of bureaucratic standardization, cultural prestige, and selective coercion. When the coercion became insufficient and the cultural prestige faded, what remained was a bureaucratic structure without a legitimating idea. A state that could administer but could not inspire, that could govern but could not justify. Every multi-ethnic political structure in the modern world faces a version of this problem. The European Union, which in some geographic respects covers territories similar to the old Habsburg sphere of influence, attempts to build a voluntary version of what the Habsburgs tried to maintain by force. A common institutional framework across diverse national identities. The difficulties the EU has encountered in building genuine political solidarity across its member states echo, in a different register, the difficulties that 19th century Vienna faced in persuading Hungarians, Czechs, and Italians that their interests were best served within a common Habsburg framework. The Austrian Empire's final answer to the question of how to govern diversity was the Ausgleich of 1867. Share power with your strongest challenger and hope the arrangement holds. It held for 51 years. Then a Serbian nationalist shot the Habsburg heir in Sarajevo, and the empire that had survived Napoleon, revolution, and military humiliation discovered that it could not survive a question it had spent a century avoiding. What do you do when the people you govern would rather govern themselves? The answer, in 1918, was the same answer that had been available in 1848, in 1866, and in 1867. You let them go. The difference was that by 1918, the letting go came at the cost of the First World War, the deaths of approximately 17 million people, and the destruction of the European order that the Congress of Vienna had spent 30 years constructing. The empire that chose to transform itself rather than collapse in 1867 eventually collapsed anyway. Not because the transformation was wrong, but because it came 50 years too late, in a world that had already moved past the point where any transformation of the Habsburg system could have kept pace. Vienna is still there. The Schönbrunn is still there. The Lipizzaner horses still perform at the Spanish riding school. The Habsburg crypt still holds the remains of the dynasty in its copper sarcophagi, each one a monument to a form of power that believed itself eternal. And the question that destroyed the empire: can one government legitimately rule people who did not choose it? is still, in various forms, being answered across the world every day.